The morning sun stretched its golden fingers across the parking lot of Jefferson High School, casting long shadows between rows of student cars and faculty spots. Elena Rodriguez pulled into space number 28, the same number she'd written in her planner the night before in neat, controlled handwriting. Her compact sedan whispered to a stop, and for a moment she sat in the driver's seat, hands gripping the steering wheel, heart pounding with a strange mix of nerves and resolve. This was a new beginning. She had come to Denver for a reason, to leave behind the weight of her past in Chicago and prove to herself that she could still make a difference. Not just as a teacher, but as someone who could change lives. She exhaled slowly and stepped out of the car, adjusting her pressed navy blue pantsuit, smoothing the front of her blazer. Her dark hair was pulled into a professional bun, and her low heels clicked with quiet purpose as she walked toward the main entrance of the school. Her expression was calm, but her eyes held a subtle fire, a steeliness that came not from arrogance, but from years of struggle and survival. Jefferson High School rose before her, 3 stories of brick and glass, banners fluttering that boasted achievements in academics, sports, and the arts. On the surface, it looked like any top-performing suburban school. But Elena had already heard the whispers. Beneath the accolades and college acceptance rates, there was a deeper problem, one no test scores could measure. A culture of fear. Bullying that had taken root like a stubborn weed. Students silenced by intimidation. And teachers worn down until they either surrendered or left. Elena had been hired to replace a beloved veteran, Mrs. Henderson, who had taken early retirement. Officially, it was framed as a personal decision, but during the interview, the principal had referred vaguely to challenges with student conduct. It hadn't taken Elena long to learn the truth. Mrs. Henderson had been driven out. Not by administration or parents, but by students. A particular group of them. A pack of predators in varsity jackets. The main hallway buzzed with the energy of students returning from summer break. Some wandered in clumps, laughing too loud, others moved with sleepy reluctance, headphones jammed in. As Elena passed, a few glanced at her, their eyes flicking up and down, registering her as the new teacher, before turning away. She offered a smile to each one, not deterred by their indifference. She found her classroom, room 237, tucked into the corner of the second floor. Sunlight streamed through the large windows, spilling across rows of empty desks. Elena stood in the doorway for a beat, letting the moment settle. This was her space now. She moved efficiently, arranging the room just so. Desks in a semicircle to encourage discussion, motivational quotes taped neatly along the walls. On the windowsill, she placed a small succulent she'd brought from home, a tiny defiance symbol of life in the cold institution of public education. The bell rang, sharp and startling, and students began to trickle in. Elena stood by the door, greeting each one by name, checking them against her roster. Most responded with polite confusion. A teacher who greeted them like real people. That was new. Then he walked in. 6'2", sandy blonde hair swept back like a movie star, blue eyes scanning the room with the ease of someone who never had to ask for permission. Connor Matthews. His presence preceded him, wrapped in effortless confidence. Behind him came his shadows, Brandon Torres, broad-shouldered and scowling, and Ryan Chen, quiet but alert, like a calculating chess player. The 3 of them barely glanced at Elena. They took seats in the back row without acknowledgement, chuckling at something on Connor's phone. Elena noted it without a word. She moved to the front of the room. "Good morning, everyone. I'm Miss Rodriguez. I'll be your English teacher this year." A few heads turned. A couple nodded. Connor muttered something, and Brandon snorted. "Before we dive into the syllabus, I want you to know what this classroom will be. A safe space." That drew a reaction. Connor laughed out loud. "Safe space? What is this, kindergarten?" Laughter trickled through the room. Elena's expression didn't change. "I mean a space where everyone feels respected, heard, and challenged to grow, she said, meeting Connor's gaze evenly. That includes you. Brandon leaned over, stage whispering, she already knows your name, bro teacher's pet alert. More laughter. Elena continued, unfazed. She spoke with warmth and confidence about her love for stories, how literature could be a mirror and a window, a way to see ourselves and others more clearly. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't beg for attention. And yet, something in her presence slowly quieted the room. Even as Connor slipped in an earbud, even as Ryan tapped his pen absently, Elena didn't flinch. She gently, firmly asked Connor to remove the earbud. He did, eventually. The rest of the class watched, waiting to see what would happen next. What they didn't see, what none of them could have guessed, was the storm that lived beneath her calm exterior. Elena had spent 15 years training in Taekwondo. She had a third-degree black belt. Not a weekend warrior hobby, but hard-earned mastery. She had bruised, bled, and broken through boards and barriers. She had trained through heartbreak, through fear, through nights in a Chicago neighborhood where survival was a skill. Her parents had enrolled her in martial arts after she came home one too many times with a swollen lip or a broken pencil case. Taekwondo hadn't just made her stronger, it had saved her life. That first class ended without incident. The students filed out, some offering half-hearted thank yous, others not bothering. Connor and his crew were the last to leave. As he passed her desk, he smirked. Nice speech, Miss R. Let's see how long you last. Elena smiled. Challenge accepted. He froze, just for a second, thrown by her composure. Then he laughed and walked away. When the classroom was empty again, Elena sat at her desk, fingers laced, staring out the window. This was her battleground now. Not with fists. Not with kicks. But with unshakable resolve. She wasn't here to win popularity. She wasn't here to be liked. She was here to teach. To protect. To prove that even in a place ruled by fear, one person's strength, quiet, firm, and rooted in something deeper, could change everything. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? The second week at Jefferson High began with the same routine, the same bell, the same stream of students flooding the halls like a rising tide, the same distant look in the eyes of overworked teachers passing each other with half-hearted greetings. But for Elena Rodriguez, the sameness was only surface level. She had begun to see the subtle signs, the cracks behind the polished veneer of Jefferson's reputation. It was in the way students flinched when passing certain lockers, or how they avoided eye contact when Connor Matthews strolled down the hallway with Brandon and Ryan trailing behind him. It was in the quiet girl who sat near the door with her sketchbook held tight to her chest, eyes downcast, as though hoping to be invisible. And it was in the silence that followed every small act of cruelty, the way no one spoke up, no one intervened. Elena knew that silence all too well. Her second Monday in room 237 started with an unexpected note on her desk. No name, just blocky handwriting on lined paper, be careful. They made Mrs. Henderson cry. She read it twice, then folded it neatly and tucked it into the back of her planner. She didn't need the warning to know she was being tested. Connor had already begun with small interruptions. Talking during lectures, tossing wadded paper at the wastebasket from the back row, laughing just a little too loudly whenever she turned her back. Brandon muttered under his breath every time she handed back graded assignments, and Ryan had turned in a plagiarized essay from a blog post, bold enough to think she wouldn't notice. Elena had returned it with a calm note offering a chance to resubmit it honestly, a quiet warning that she wasn't as easy to manipulate as they expected. She handled each disruption with poise and precision, responding not with anger but with consistency. There were no punishments shouted across the room, no loss of control. Only clear expectations, repeated without wavering, and consequences applied with quiet firmness. What the boys didn't know was that Elena had grown up navigating far more dangerous dynamics. Her childhood in Englewood, on the south side of Chicago, had been a battlefield in its own right. Her parents, immigrants who worked day and night to keep food on the table, had enrolled her in Taekwondo after she came home from school one day with a black eye and a split lip. She'd told them she'd fallen, but they hadn't believed her. The truth was that she'd stood up to a girl twice her size who had been tormenting her for weeks. That night, her father scraped together the money for her first martial arts class, and her life changed. Master Kim had been a small man with a quiet voice and eyes that seemed to see everything. From the very first session, Elena understood that this wasn't about learning how to fight. It was about learning how not to. How to carry yourself. How to read a room. How to choose your battles. He had taught her that true strength had nothing to do with fists, it lived in discipline, restraint, and presence. Over the years, she trained until her body was an extension of her will, and her mind became a fortress that no insult or threat could penetrate. She had carried those lessons into every classroom since. Still, there were days when the memories crept in. She would look at a student like Maria, who always sat in the second row, clutching her notebook like a shield, and she would remember herself at 13, trying to disappear into the background of a world that never felt safe. Or David, the boy who struggled to read aloud but stayed after class to try again, determined to get it right. Or Sophia, quiet and kind, who always volunteered to help but never spoke above a whisper. Elena saw pieces of her past in all of them, and it only deepened her resolve. By Wednesday, the undercurrent of tension in room 237 had shifted. The usual troublemakers were louder, bolder, and more coordinated. Connor began speaking over her deliberately during discussions, injecting snide remarks or whispering to Brandon just loud enough to be disruptive. Brandon occasionally knocked books off nearby desks as a joke, and Ryan kept scribbling cartoons of Elena in the margins of his notes, some cruel, some oddly detailed. One afternoon, she arrived to find all the desks rearranged backward, facing the windows, with a note taped to the board that read, "We wanted a better view." Elena stood at the doorway, took a slow breath, and began moving them back without a word. The students who weren't part of the crew noticed. Elena began receiving small, almost imperceptible signals. Maria lingering a little longer after class, as if unsure whether to speak, David offering to help stack books without being asked, Sophia slipping her a carefully folded paper with a poem titled, "Silence is a Weapon." Elena read it that evening at home and felt her throat tighten. These students were watching. They were waiting to see if she would break. She wouldn't. That Friday, Elena stayed after school grading essays while the building emptied out. The hallway outside her classroom grew quiet, the echoes of slamming lockers and distant laughter fading into silence. She was just packing up when a soft knock came at her door. It was Jessica Park. Elena recognized her from roll call but couldn't remember her ever speaking in class. "Miss Rodriguez," Jessica said, hesitating in the doorway, "can I sit for a minute?" Elena nodded. Jessica stepped inside and looked around the room, her fingers fidgeting with the hem of her sleeve. "I just wanted to say, you're different from the other teachers. They usually avoid eye contact by now." Elena offered a soft smile. "I don't scare easily." "I know. That's why I came." Jessica sat down and leaned forward. "Be careful, okay? Connor doesn't like to lose. When he feels threatened, he always escalates. Last year, he and Brandon drove a teacher out. They made it look like an accident. A car got keyed. There were fake emails. Even drugs planted in his car. He left in the middle of the semester. Never came back." Elena felt a cold edge slice through her chest. "Thank you for telling me, Jessica." Jessica looked at her, eyes serious. "They're planning something again. I don't know what yet, but they don't like that you're not scared." Elena didn't flinch. "Neither did you. You're here." Jessica blinked, then nodded slowly. Yeah. I guess I am. When the girl left, Elena sat alone for a long while, letting the silence fill the room. She turned off the lights, locked the door, and walked down the hallway with her heels clicking in steady rhythm. The war hadn't started yet. But she could feel the ground shifting beneath her feet. They thought she was just another teacher to break. What they didn't know was that she had already lived through worse and come out stronger. She didn't just teach literature. She taught survival. And this classroom, room 237, was about to become the last place any bully would expect to be defeated. By the third week of the semester, room 237 had become more than just a classroom. It had become a battleground disguised in bulletin boards and literature posters, a place where unspoken tension simmered beneath the surface of ordinary school life. Elena Rodriguez felt it in the shift of air when she walked in each morning, the quiet glances between students, the heavy silence that followed certain jokes, the subtle hesitations before some kids raised their hands. She recognized the signs, not because someone told her, but because she had lived it before. In Englewood, fear wore a different face, but its presence was the same, always lurking, always waiting for someone to blink first. The prank started small, the kind that gave just enough room for plausible deniability. One morning, she arrived to find her desk drawers glued shut. It took the janitor over an hour to pry them open with a crowbar. That same week, someone had flipped the class seating chart upside down on her laptop, replacing names with cartoonish nicknames: Miss Rodriguez, the Nerd Squad, Cry Baby Maria. She didn't react. She printed out a new chart and continued teaching as if nothing had happened, her voice steady, her posture grounded. But privately, she began documenting every incident, compiling a growing file of suspicious behavior, timestamps, screenshots, and photos. She wasn't waiting to be believed. She was building proof. The next phase was more personal. A fake social media account appeared under her name, filled with fabricated quotes, photoshopped pictures, and strange, suggestive captions. The account quickly gained followers among students, and rumors started to ripple through the school. Elena found out when Sophia, her quiet poet, approached her with flushed cheeks and trembling hands. "Miss Rodriguez," she whispered, eyes wide, "they're saying things online, about you." Elena spent the evening reporting the account, contacting the school's IT department, and documenting every interaction. Again, she said nothing to the class. She just looked more closely at Connor's smirking face and the way Brandon leaned back in his chair with folded arms, satisfied like a boy who had knocked down another piece of glassware and found no consequence. But something unexpected began to bloom in the chaos: solidarity. Students who had once remained silent started noticing what was happening and choosing sides. Maria stayed after class more frequently, asking Elena questions about stories but clearly wanting to linger, to feel safe. David began volunteering to read aloud, his voice shaky but determined, and when someone in the back snickered, Elena shut it down with one firm look. Sophia's poems became bolder, lines sharpened with something that sounded almost like defiance. Room 237, for all its turbulence, was starting to feel like a place of refuge for those who needed it most. Elena didn't let on that she knew she was being watched. She sensed it in the way Connor stared at her when he thought she wasn't looking, the way Ryan's notebook stayed closed during lessons, as if its contents mattered more than anything being taught. She suspected they were planning something more serious, something designed not to rattle her but to remove her. She wasn't scared. She was ready. She had been through worse. She remembered the night in Chicago when she was 15, walking home from the dojang, her gym bag slung over one shoulder, when a group of boys cornered her at the alley behind the corner store. She had never thrown a punch that night. Instead, she stood her ground, eyes locked, posture strong, and whispered the phrase Master Kim had drilled into her 1,000 times: strength doesn't start with fists, it starts with stillness. They backed off, not because she fought, but because they sensed she would if she had to. That same steel lived in her now. So she planted herself deeper in Jefferson High. She attended every staff meeting, volunteered for lunchtime hall duty, and smiled through the whispers of colleagues who were either intimidated by her reputation or skeptical of her resolve. The administration remained distant. Mr. Washington, the principal, seemed reluctant to engage directly with student discipline, often dismissing concerns with polite euphemisms and vague nods to policy. But Elena didn't wait for backup. She had a plan. She installed a discreet secondary camera in her classroom, one with audio, one that uploaded footage directly to a secure cloud. She consulted a lawyer, a friend from her Chicago days who specialized in education law, and laid out her situation without drama. Just facts. She asked about her rights, the legal limits of classroom authority, and how far she could go to defend herself and her students if something physical happened. Her friend, a former high school teacher turned attorney, said it clearly: if they come at you, Elena, and you don't respond, you lose your authority. But if you respond appropriately and with restraint, you win their respect. Just make sure the cameras are rolling. She didn't tell her students any of this. But they sensed the shift. One day, when class ended and the room cleared out, Jessica lingered again, her backpack slung loosely over one shoulder. "They're pushing harder," she said quietly, her eyes flicking toward the window where Connor stood across the courtyard laughing with Brandon and Ryan. "They think you're bluffing. That you'll quit like the others." Elena looked at her calmly. "Do you think I will?" Jessica smiled for the first time, a crooked grin filled with something close to admiration. "No. That's why they're afraid of you." That weekend, Elena received an anonymous envelope in her school mailbox. Inside were printed screenshots of a group chat among students, detailing planned pranks, slanderous jokes, and threats written in thinly veiled terms. No names, but enough to recognize the pattern. Elena took it as confirmation. They were testing boundaries, and she was about to set them for good. The following Monday, she walked into room 237 and stood silently for a moment before beginning class. The students noticed something different in her posture, the way her gaze swept over each face and lingered a beat too long on Connor and his crew. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't change the lesson. But the temperature in the room dropped a degree, and the air thickened with the tension of something unspoken. Elena taught with her usual grace, but behind her calm tone was a fire stoked and ready. The message was clear without a word being said, she knew. And she was waiting. By the time the final bell rang, Elena knew one thing for certain. They would come for her soon. Not with fists, maybe, but with chaos. They would push until something cracked. What they hadn't figured out yet was that she didn't break. She had only just begun to fight. Thursday arrived with a crispness in the air that hinted at the early days of fall. Leaves along the sidewalk had begun to trade their green for gold, and the morning sun painted the school's brick walls in a warm amber glow. But inside Jefferson High, the atmosphere was anything but tranquil. Word had started to spread, whispers that something was brewing in room 237, that Miss Rodriguez wasn't like the others, that maybe, just maybe, someone had finally stood her ground against the untouchable trio. Most of the rumors were exaggerated, some completely fabricated, but the core truth remained unchanged: Elena hadn't flinched. And the boys didn't like it. That day's lesson was one Elena had been looking forward to all week. She was introducing To Kill a Mockingbird, her favorite novel to teach, a story layered with courage, conscience, and quiet strength, values she believed her students desperately needed to engage with. She'd prepared discussion questions that challenged students to think about moral bravery, about standing for justice when it was unpopular or dangerous. As the class settled in, she noticed a curious stillness in the room. Connor sat in his usual back row seat, but his legs were stretched out arrogantly in the aisle. Brandon leaned forward with his elbows on the desk, cracking his knuckles one by one. Ryan was flipping through his notebook, though he wasn't taking notes. Elena welcomed the class, introduced the themes of the novel, and began by asking a simple but powerful question: what does it mean to stand up for what's right when everyone else is silent? A few hands rose. Sophia, timid as ever, lifted hers tentatively. But before she could speak, Connor's voice sliced through the air. "This is stupid," he declared, slamming his book shut with a loud clap that made several students jump. "Nobody cares about some dusty old book. Teach us something useful, like how not to be boring." A few snickers echoed across the room, but most students went quiet, their eyes darting between Connor and Elena. Elena didn't rush to respond. She turned to the board, wrote the word "justice" in bold capital letters, then turned back to the class. "Literature helps us understand the human experience," she said calmly. "The themes in this book are as relevant today as they were when it was written. Prejudice. Injustice. Courage. Can anyone give a modern example of that?" Sophia raised her hand again, but before she could speak, Connor waved her off with a scoff. "Here's your example, being forced to sit in this class with a teacher who probably couldn't land a real job and had to settle for babysitting." The silence that followed was heavy and immediate. Even Brandon blinked, surprised at the cruelty of the comment. Ryan's smirk faltered. Elena felt every eye turn to her, waiting to see what she would do. She drew in a breath, slow and steady, letting the air fill her lungs before she spoke. "Connor," she said, her voice level, "that comment was inappropriate and disrespectful. Please stay after class so we can discuss it." Connor's chair screeched as he pushed back and stood. He was tall, much taller than Elena, with the swagger of someone who had never been challenged. He stepped forward, closing the space between them with slow, deliberate strides. "Or what?" he said, towering over her. "You'll call my parents? They'll donate a new scoreboard and make it go away. That's how it works. That's how it's always worked." Brandon rose behind him, arms crossed, and Ryan didn't move, but Elena could see the gleam of anticipation in his eyes. The class held its breath. Some students reached for their phones under the desks, ready to record. Elena didn't move. "Sit down, Connor," she said, her tone unshaken. "Make me," he challenged, taking another step forward. "Come on. You think you're tough? You think you're special because you teach English? You're just another loser hiding in a classroom pretending you've got power." Brandon flanked her left side now, a smirk curling on his lips. "Yeah, Miss Rodriguez. Show us what you've got." For a moment, time stretched thin. Elena stood her ground, arms at her sides, eyes locked with Connor's. She didn't posture, didn't raise her voice, didn't flinch. Instead, she let silence do the work. Then, as Connor reached for her desk, swiping a copy of To Kill a Mockingbird and sending her papers fluttering to the floor, Elena moved. It was subtle. Elegant. Almost invisible to anyone untrained. She stepped forward on her back foot, shifted her weight, and gently guided Connor's arm away from the desk with a deflection technique so smooth it looked accidental. To most students, it appeared as if Connor had simply lost his balance. But Connor felt it. The control. The power behind that minimal contact. His arm stopped mid-motion, redirected effortlessly, and for the first time since entering her class, his cocky certainty faltered. His eyes widened. "Return to your seat," Elena said quietly, her voice soft but firm. "Now." Connor hesitated. Brandon, confused by the sudden shift, stepped forward angrily. "Did you just touch him? That's assault. You can't put your hands on students." Elena didn't blink. "I used a basic defensive movement to prevent the destruction of school property. Everything that just happened is recorded, by the school's security system and, I suspect, more than one phone in this room." She tilted her head slightly toward the corner camera mounted above the door. The room was frozen. Ryan looked up, suddenly remembering the camera's presence. A few students slowly lowered their phones, no longer filming for entertainment, but stunned by what they'd just witnessed. Ryan reached for Connor's arm. "Come on, man. Let's go." But Connor couldn't back down. His pride was louder than his fear. "This isn't over," he said through clenched teeth. "You think you're special? We'll see about that." Still, he backed away, reluctantly. Brandon followed, grumbling under his breath. Ryan hung behind just long enough to glance at Elena, and for a second, just a second, there was something that looked like respect in his eyes. When the door closed behind them, the air rushed back into the room. Maria let out the breath she hadn't realized she was holding. David sat up straighter, his hands no longer clenched on the desk. Sophia was practically glowing. Elena bent to collect her papers and returned to the front of the room. She placed the book back on her desk, straightened her spine, and looked out at her class. "Let's continue," she said simply, and picked up where she'd left off. But everyone in that room knew something had changed. A line had been drawn, not with violence, but with unshakable clarity. The predator had tested his prey, and found steel instead of fear. Connor had walked into room 237 certain he ruled the school. He walked out no longer sure. And that uncertainty was the beginning of everything. By the next morning, Jefferson High was buzzing like a disturbed hive. What had happened in room 237 wasn't just gossip, it was wildfire. The details varied wildly depending on who told it. Some students claimed Miss Rodriguez had flipped Connor over her shoulder and pinned him against the wall. Others said she was a retired cop or a CIA agent planted undercover to clean up the school. A few whispered she knew ancient martial arts and had trained in secret military camps. The truth, though far simpler, was more powerful than any exaggeration. Elena had stood her ground, calmly, confidently, and with absolute control. She hadn't shouted. She hadn't fought. She had simply made it clear that intimidation would no longer rule her classroom. And for students who had spent years watching bullies walk over teachers, it was the first sign of hope they'd seen in a long time. The reaction was immediate. Elena's afternoon classes were suddenly attentive. Disruptive students sat up straighter. A few even raised their hands without being prompted. Teachers who had previously greeted her with vague nods now stopped her in the hallway to offer words of admiration, some curious, others cautiously impressed. "Heard you handled yourself yesterday," one whispered near the coffee machine in the teacher's lounge. "That took guts." Mr. Lopez from the science department gave her a quiet thumbs up. Even the school librarian left a note in her box: "If you ever teach a self-defense class, I'd like to sign up." But with the rising respect came another shift, something more dangerous. Elena could feel it in the way Connor stared at her from across the lunchroom, his jaw tight, his eyes calculating. He wasn't angry in the way that teenagers usually got angry. He was wounded. Publicly humiliated. And students like Connor didn't absorb humiliation quietly. They plotted. They regrouped. And they retaliated. Elena stayed alert. Every morning, she checked her classroom for signs of tampering. She double-checked the hidden camera feed. She continued recording incidents in her file, documenting anything out of place. She reviewed security footage at night, not out of paranoia, but out of preparation. She wasn't afraid, but she refused to be caught off guard. It wasn't long before the next strike came. Monday morning, her phone buzzed with a series of notifications. A new social media account had been created, this one pretending to be a parent from the community, accusing Elena of inappropriate behavior with male students. It was subtle enough not to trigger immediate action from administrators but damaging enough to raise eyebrows. The comments on the fake posts piled up quickly. "Another teacher who thinks she's invincible," one read. "Should have stayed in Chicago," read another. That same day, an anonymous email was sent to the school board with doctored photos and complaints about Elena's aggressive behavior in the classroom. The email referenced the incident with Connor, twisting the facts to make it appear as if Elena had physically assaulted a student without provocation. The principal, Mr. Washington, called her into his office, his face pale and pinched. "I received a concerning email this morning," he began, avoiding eye contact. Anonymous, but detailed. It references the incident with Connor Matthews. Elena didn't flinch. I expected as much. I've submitted a report of my own. It includes video footage from both the school's camera and my personal classroom feed. I'd recommend you review them before making assumptions. Mr. Washington shifted uncomfortably. You installed your own camera? I did. Legally, and for my safety. I've informed the IT department and documented every step. He nodded slowly, clearly uncertain how to proceed. Miss Rodriguez, the Matthews family is very involved with this school. They're longtime donors. If this becomes a public matter. With all due respect, Elena interrupted, her tone unwavering, if we allow students to weaponize influence and social media against teachers who maintain discipline, then we're teaching them that power matters more than truth. He didn't respond. He simply tapped a pen against his desk and dismissed her with a sigh. Elena knew she was on her own. But that wasn't new. Later that day, while sorting through assignments, Jessica knocked on her door again. She looked pale, nervous, her eyes darting around the hallway before stepping inside. They're planning something, she whispered. Bigger than before. Elena closed her laptop. What did you hear? They're saying they're gonna embarrass you in front of everyone. Like, destroy you. Publicly. They want to make you crack so the school has to fire you. They don't care how. Elena leaned forward, her voice low and calm. Thank you for telling me, Jessica. You don't have to get involved any further. Jessica shook her head. You don't understand. Last year, Mr. Campbell tried to stand up to them. He gave Connor detention for cheating. A week later, someone called the cops. Said there were drugs in his car. They actually found something in his trunk. He swore it wasn't his. But it didn't matter. The damage was done. The school pushed him out quietly. He's teaching somewhere in the foothills now. They ruined him. Elena's stomach turned, not with fear, but with the cold fury of injustice. Why didn't anyone speak up? Because we were scared, Jessica admitted. Connor had people everywhere. He knew who to pressure. Who to bribe. Who to threaten. Elena's gaze didn't waver. That ends now. She didn't tell Jessica about the extra security measures she had taken. That she had already reached out to a private investigator in Chicago who owed her a favor. That she was now backing up her camera feeds to a second encrypted server, one far outside the school's jurisdiction. She didn't mention that she had begun printing out every harassing comment, every suspicious email, every screenshot of the fake accounts. This wasn't about defending her name anymore. This was about taking back control of a culture that had been poisoned by fear and power. As Jessica left, Elena looked around her classroom. The desks, the books, the motivational posters, on the surface, it was just another high school room. But to her, it was a sanctuary worth protecting. Not just for herself, but for the quiet ones. The bruised. The unheard. The students who sat each day praying not to be noticed. This room had become something bigger than a classroom. It was becoming a battleground for truth, for fairness, for strength that didn't rely on fists or threats. And Elena wasn't just a teacher anymore. She was a guardian. A witness. A force. Whatever Connor was planning, she would be ready. And when the next confrontation came, it wouldn't be just about her. It would be about every student who had ever been silenced. Every teacher who had ever been run off. Every voice that had been made to believe it didn't matter. Because this time, someone was going to speak back. And this time, the bullies wouldn't win. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? Friday morning arrived with a deceptive calm. The sky over Denver was a clear, unbothered blue, the air crisp and light as students filed into Jefferson High, chatting about weekend plans and college applications. But inside room 237, tension gathered like a storm cloud. Elena Rodriguez could feel it before she even opened her classroom door. She noticed the subtle glances, the unusual quiet, the way Connor Matthews and his crew entered the room without their usual swagger. They sat with an eerie stillness, like actors waiting for their cue. Elena had seen enough ambushes in her life to recognize the signs. But she taught her lesson as if it were any other day, keeping her tone even and her smile calm, her senses alert for whatever they had planned. It was presentation day. Students were to share their creative projects interpreting classic literature. Elena had designed the assignment to encourage connection, to help them find pieces of themselves in the stories they read. Maria had created a multimedia piece comparing her immigrant journey with the themes in The Namesake. David had rewritten a modern scene from Romeo and Juliet, set in Denver, and was eager to perform it. Sophia had composed 3 original poems inspired by Emily Dickinson's exploration of solitude and strength. The students had worked hard. They were nervous but proud. They deserved to be heard. Maria was the first to present. She stood at the front of the room, her voice soft but steady, a slideshow behind her showing photos of her family, their journey from Mexico, and her reflections on identity. The class listened respectfully, at least most of them. As Maria shared a slide showing her mother cleaning offices at night, her voice cracked with emotion. That was when Connor stood up. "This is boring," he said loudly, stretching like he had just woken from a nap. "Nobody cares about her sob story." The words landed like a slap. Maria froze, her face draining of color. The room fell into stunned silence. Sophia looked horrified. David turned red with anger. But Elena was already moving. "Sit down, Connor," she said, her voice sharp enough to cut through the air. "Maria has the floor." Connor took a step forward instead. "Or what?" he said. "You gonna do your little karate move again?" Brandon and Ryan rose with him, flanking him like bodyguards. They moved toward Elena's desk in a slow, rehearsed rhythm. Phones began appearing on desks, screens lit up, cameras ready. Students shrank back, unsure what to do, uncertain whether they were witnessing a confrontation or the beginning of something much worse. "I think it's time someone taught you a real lesson," Brandon said, cracking his knuckles, his grin wide and cruel. "About respect." Elena stepped away from her desk, giving herself space. Her hands were relaxed by her sides, but her stance was firm, grounded. She met Connor's eyes without flinching. "The only lesson being taught here today," she said steadily, "is about literature. And you're interrupting." Connor moved suddenly, lunging forward, reaching out as if to push her aside. That was his mistake. Elena reacted not out of panic, but with muscle memory honed over 15 years of discipline. She sidestepped his reach with a pivot, redirected his momentum, and guided his wrist down and past her in a smooth Taekwondo wrist control technique. To the watching students, it looked like Connor had simply stumbled, losing his footing and catching himself on a desk. But Connor knew exactly what had happened. She hadn't hurt him. She hadn't even really restrained him. But in that effortless moment, she had made him feel powerless. Brandon charged next, his movement fueled by brute force rather than skill. Elena didn't hesitate. She shifted her weight, let him come forward, and used his momentum against him. He hit the whiteboard with a dull thud, scattering the magnetic poetry words across the wall like confetti. He groaned as he slid down, stunned. Ryan, more calculating than the other two, tried to grab her from behind. Elena sensed him coming, dropped her weight, turned her hips, and escaped with a basic evasion move, stepping safely out of reach. Ryan grabbed nothing but air and stumbled sideways, off balance. 10 seconds. That's all it took. No punches. No kicks. No injuries. Just control. Precision. Restraint. The room was silent except for the heavy breathing of three boys whose pride had just been shattered in front of their peers. "That's assault," Connor spat, his face red with rage and humiliation. "You attacked us. You're done here." Elena straightened her blazer, adjusted her sleeves, and looked directly at him. "I used minimal defensive techniques to protect myself and my students from an aggressive physical threat. This entire incident is recorded, by the school's security system, my classroom camera, and several phones in this room." She turned to the class. "If anyone would like to share that footage with the administration, I welcome it." The boys looked around. Dozens of phones were up. None of them held sympathy. None of them looked afraid anymore. "This isn't over," Connor hissed. "My father will end your career. You'll be finished in this town." Elena didn't raise her voice. "Your father is welcome to review the video. Along with the documentation I've compiled over the past month. Including your threats, your harassment, and your attempted framing of Mr. Campbell." Connor's face went pale. "You can't prove anything." "Can't I?" she asked softly. Jessica stood up from the back of the room, holding her phone. "I kept the texts," she said, her voice steady. "From when he bragged about it." Then Marcus stood. "I've got screenshots of their group chat. Planning everything." One by one, more students rose. Phones in hand. Eyes wide with courage they hadn't known they possessed. It wasn't just about Connor anymore. It was about all the years of silence. All the moments they'd looked the other way. All the damage they wished they'd spoken up against. And now they were ready. Connor looked around wildly, realizing the tide had turned. His power had evaporated, slipping away like sand through his fingers. He stormed out of the room without another word, Brandon and Ryan trailing behind him in stunned silence. Elena turned to Maria, who stood frozen near the projector. "Please continue," she said gently. "We'd all like to hear your story." Maria looked down, then up, her eyes shining but her voice stronger now. "Okay," she said, and picked up right where she'd left off. As she spoke, the energy in the room changed. It wasn't just relief. It was release. It was the feeling of something breaking, something long held and harmful finally shattering. Room 237 had always been Elena's battlefield. But today, it became something more. A sanctuary. A place where voices could rise. Where truth could stand taller than fear. And as she listened to Maria's story, Elena knew the real fight wasn't over. But the first victory had been won. And from here on out, things would never be the same. By lunchtime, what had happened in room 237 wasn't just a school-wide rumor, it was a digital wildfire. Videos of the confrontation were circulating like lightning on every social media platform students could access. Clips of Connor stumbling, Brandon crashing into the whiteboard, and Elena calmly redirecting Ryan's reach were stitched together with dramatic music and captions like, "Miss or strikes back," and "She's not the one." Some students edited them into mock movie trailers, while others debated the ethics in long comment threads. But among the memes and mockery was a sense of collective awe, an unspoken agreement that, for the first time in a long time, someone had stood up to the fear. Elena watched the chaos unfold quietly from her desk during her prep period. She didn't check the videos or respond to the comments. She just sipped her tea, heart steady, mind clear. This wasn't about viral moments or popularity. It was about the truth. About restoring balance where it had been lost for too long. Still, she knew what came next. Connor wouldn't retreat quietly. His threats hadn't been empty. And she was about to see just how far his father was willing to go. It didn't take long. That afternoon, she was summoned to the principal's office. The secretary looked nervous as she handed over the slip. "He's not in a good mood," she said in a whisper. Elena nodded, already expecting worse. When she entered the office, Richard Matthews was pacing like a caged lion. He was tall, broad-shouldered, in a tailored suit that screamed money and connections. His face was red with fury, lips pressed into a hard line. Mr. Washington sat behind his desk, beads of sweat gathering at his temple, his hands clasped like he was praying for this to be over before it began. "This is the teacher who assaulted my son," Richard barked, turning to Elena with a look of disgust. "She's half his size." Elena closed the door behind her and took a seat without being asked. Her presence was calm, controlled, a sharp contrast to the tension suffocating the room. She placed a folder on the desk and looked Richard Matthews directly in the eye. "Inside this folder," she said evenly, "you'll find documentation of your son's behavior over the last 2 months, including copies of emails, incident reports, screenshots of harassing posts, and footage from 3 different angles showing what happened in my classroom today." Richard grabbed the folder without opening it. "Connor says you attacked him. Humiliated him. You laid hands on him in front of his peers. That is grounds for termination." "No," Elena replied, her tone steady, "it's grounds for self-defense. I used minimal, non-aggressive techniques to de-escalate a situation where 3 students moved to physically intimidate me and disrupt my class. And every second is recorded." Mr. Washington cleared his throat weakly. "Mr. Matthews, I've reviewed the footage from the classroom camera, and—" "Don't you dare side with her," Richard snapped, slamming his palm against the desk. "My family has supported this school for over a decade. I have donated to every building campaign, every sports initiative, every scholarship program. And this is how you treat my son?" Elena didn't blink. "Your son has terrorized this school for years. Teachers have left. Students have suffered. And until now, no one held him accountable because of his last name. That ends today." Richard's face darkened. "I will ruin you. I'll make sure you never teach again." "I've taught in inner-city Chicago," Elena said, her voice like ice. "I've faced gang members in my classroom. I've broken up knife fights. I've walked through metal detectors and kept students safe while they cried because their friends were shot over the weekend. I've stared down fathers who thought raising their voice meant raising their worth. You're not new to me, Mr. Matthews. You're just louder." Mr. Washington opened his mouth, but Elena stood up before he could speak. "I'm not here to plead for my job," she said. "I'm here to say that if this school continues to protect bullies, I'll take this footage to the district, to the school board, to the press if necessary. I'll file formal complaints. I'll request a full investigation into Mr. Campbell's forced departure last year, because I now have students willing to testify that your son and his friends planted evidence to frame him. I'll bring everything into the light." There was a long, tense silence. Richard Matthews looked like he'd swallowed broken glass. Mr. Washington paled visibly. "What do you want?" Richard finally asked, his voice tight. "Justice," Elena answered. "Your son and his friends will face disciplinary action, real consequences. They will apologize to every student and teacher they've harassed. They will complete community service and attend counseling to address their behavior. And if you agree to this, I won't press charges for harassment or assault. But if you fight this, I go public." Mr. Washington looked from Elena to Richard, clearly weighing the lesser of 2 disasters. Richard, for once, had no counterattack. His bravado had met something he didn't expect. A woman who wasn't afraid of him. It took 2 hours of tense negotiation, but in the end, the terms were accepted. Connor, Brandon, and Ryan were suspended for 2 weeks, ordered to complete 100 hours of community service, and required to attend weekly anger management sessions. Their return would be conditional, any future infractions would result in immediate expulsion. They would also issue written and verbal apologies to each student and faculty member they had harassed. The news spread like a lightning bolt. For the first time in years, students saw that the rules could apply to everyone, even the untouchable. Teachers began whispering Elena's name with new respect. A group of juniors started referring to room 237 as the Revolution Room. And somewhere in the library, Jessica Park wept silently behind a book, not from fear, but from the relief of being seen, believed, and finally protected. Elena returned to her classroom just before the final bell rang. She sat at her desk, letting the silence settle around her. She didn't smile. She didn't gloat. She simply closed her eyes for a moment, letting the weight of the battle fall away. There were more fights ahead, she knew. But for today, she had won something more valuable than approval or applause. She had restored balance. She had drawn a line that would not be crossed again. And in doing so, she had given her students more than just safety. She had given them permission to stand up, for themselves, for each other, and for what was right. The echoes of room 237 would carry farther than any hallway rumor or viral video. And this was only the beginning. The Monday after the suspension felt like the first breath after a long submersion. Jefferson High still looked the same, brick walls, echoing hallways, posters peeling at the edges, but something in the air had changed. The fear that used to cling like humidity in the halls had thinned. Students walked with their heads a little higher. Some still glanced over their shoulders, unsure if the calm would last, but others smiled, nodded, even dared to speak up in ways they hadn't before. Room 237, once a quiet battleground, had become something else entirely, a haven. Elena noticed the change the moment she walked in. Students were early. Desks were already arranged, notebooks open, eyes alert. Maria greeted her with a shy but sincere good morning. David asked if she could stay after school to help him revise a story he'd been writing. Sophia placed a folded poem on Elena's desk before sitting down. And Jessica, who had once only hovered near the door, now took her seat near the front with steady eyes and a spine that seemed taller. Elena began the lesson with a simple quote written on the board: "Courage is not the absence of fear, but the triumph over it." She didn't mention Connor, Brandon, or Ryan. She didn't need to. Their absence was its own echo, and the room had already filled with new energy. Students volunteered answers. They asked questions. When someone stumbled reading aloud, others encouraged instead of mocking. It wasn't perfection, but it was progress. And progress was sacred. Outside her classroom, change was slower. The school administration, embarrassed by how public the confrontation had become, walked a tightrope. Mr. Washington barely made eye contact with Elena in the hallway, and a few teachers seemed unsure whether to treat her as a colleague or a warning. But others found their voice through her. Ms. Carroll from Social Studies began holding after-school forums on student rights. Mr. Ortiz started a lunch club for boys to talk about masculinity and emotional intelligence. It was as if the silence that had long infected the building had finally cracked open, and a new language was emerging, one of accountability, safety, and strength. Elena didn't stop with her classroom. With the principal's reluctant permission, she started an after-school self-defense club open to all students. It began with just 5 kids. By the second week, there were 20. She taught them not how to fight, but how to stand. How to recognize danger. How to speak with their posture, their eyes, their presence. She used the same lessons Master Kim had drilled into her when she was a trembling child trying to survive in Chicago. And as the students kicked padded targets, practiced wrist escapes, and learned how to breathe through fear, Elena saw the most remarkable transformation of all: they began to believe in themselves. Emma was one of them. A sophomore who had barely spoken a word in class since the beginning of the year, she had recently been the target of a digital attack. Private photos, shared without consent by a former boyfriend, had spread through group chats like wildfire. Elena found her sitting alone in the hallway one afternoon, her face pale, her fingers shaking as she scrolled through cruel messages. She didn't speak at first, just handed Elena her phone. The words on the screen were sharp, humiliating, unforgiving. "They say it's my fault," Emma whispered. "That I should have known better. Elena crouched beside her, met her gaze, and said quietly, "What happened to you is not your fault. The person who betrayed your trust, he made that choice. The ones who shared the photos, they made theirs. You don't have to carry the weight of their actions." Elena helped Emma speak with the school counselor and the administration. She made sure the matter was addressed not with whispers and denials, but with clarity and compassion. Emma eventually wrote a raw, powerful essay about consent, betrayal, and shame. Elena helped her edit it, polish it, and submit it to the school newspaper. It was published under the title, "I Trusted Him." Students read it. Teachers passed it around. It started conversations that had long been avoided. And when Emma joined the self-defense club a week later, no one laughed. No one pointed. They just made room for her on the mat. Elena also began integrating emotional resilience into her lessons. When teaching Shakespeare's Macbeth, she guided discussions about unchecked ambition, power, and guilt. When reading modern young adult novels, she asked students to connect characters' struggles with their own lives, quietly, respectfully, in journals or anonymous surveys. Some shared stories of parents who yelled too much, homes that didn't feel safe, friendships turned sour. She didn't push for details. She just gave them space to be heard, perhaps for the first time. She introduced a new unit called Words That Protect. Students wrote poems as armor, essays as shields, letters as swords. They discussed what it meant to be kind when no one else was, to speak up when silence was easier. Brandon, still suspended, hadn't returned yet. Ryan would be back soon. Connor, though, remained the question mark, off campus, undergoing mandatory counseling, his pride bruised, his reputation shaken. Rumors said his father was trying to transfer him to a private school. Elena didn't engage. She didn't wish failure on him. She wished clarity. She wished growth. And she knew from experience that sometimes, the fall was the only way up. In the meantime, room 237 flourished. It became a space where students lingered after the bell. Where shy kids read aloud. Where laughter came not at someone's expense but from genuine connection. Jessica began sketching portraits of her classmates during breaks. Sophia started submitting her poems to local competitions. David wrote a short story that made two of his peers cry. Maria helped Emma with Spanish homework, and Emma helped Maria with writing. They were healing, and they didn't even know it. One Friday evening, as Elena turned off the lights and packed her bag, she looked around at the posters, the student work pinned proudly on the wall, the mats in the corner for self-defense practice. It looked nothing like the room she'd walked into that first day. It was alive now. Worn in all the right ways. Marked by courage. Scarred by truth. And held together not by rules, but by respect. She didn't think of herself as a hero. Just as a teacher doing what teachers were meant to do, not just prepare students for exams, but prepare them for life. Not just assign books, but help them write their own stories. And if that meant standing up to bullies, speaking against systems that had let them thrive, and bearing the backlash of truth, then so be it. Because this was the work that mattered. This was the legacy she was building, not in the headlines or viral clips, but in the quiet way students looked at each other differently, treated themselves more gently, and chose to stand taller. And in room 237, that was more than enough. 2 weeks later, the door to room 237 creaked open during Elena's lunch break, and in walked Connor Matthews. Gone was the swagger, the sharp-edged confidence he once wore like armor. He didn't wear his Letterman jacket. His posture wasn't defiant but uncertain, his gaze scanning the room like he was entering unfamiliar terrain. Elena looked up from her grading, her expression neutral, her pen resting on a half-finished essay. Connor stopped a few feet from her desk, shifting his weight from foot to foot like a boy not used to silence. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then he reached into his backpack and pulled out a folded piece of paper. "I was supposed to give this to you before I returned," he said, his voice quieter than she'd ever heard it. It's from the counselor. Elena took the paper, scanned the short note confirming Connor's completion of his initial counseling sessions and approval to rejoin classes under probation. She set it aside and waited. Connor didn't move. I also wanted to say something, he added, looking not at her but at the floor. I was a jerk. I hurt people. A lot of people. I've been thinking about that a lot. Elena nodded once. Thinking is good. But what you do next matters more. Connor hesitated, then unfolded another sheet of paper. His hands trembled slightly. I made a list, he said. Everyone I can remember bullying. I want to apologize. To all of them. If they'll even talk to me. He placed the list on her desk. Names were handwritten in ink, most familiar, some surprising. Jessica. David. Maria. Sophia. Even Ryan. Elena looked up. Why now? He swallowed hard. Because I don't want to be who I was. And because I saw what happened when I lost control. You didn't scream. You didn't fight. You just stopped me. And everyone saw it. For the first time, they saw me for what I really was. And I did too. She studied him, then asked, and what did you see? He looked up slowly. A scared kid pretending to be strong. There was a long silence between them. Then Elena gestured to the chair across from her desk. Sit. Connor obeyed, more like a student than he'd ever seemed before. Elena folded her hands. You have an opportunity, Connor. Not to erase what you did, but to take responsibility and do better. Apologies are a start, but real change means putting others first. Making things right. Not for recognition. For the people you hurt. For yourself. He nodded. I want to use my position on the football team. I was thinking, I could start something. An anti-bullying campaign. Peer-led. Use my voice. Maybe even speak to freshmen, help them see early what I didn't until now. That would be a good beginning, she said. But understand this isn't about image. It's about impact. I know, he said quietly. I just want to fix something. That afternoon, Elena watched him walk down the hall, alone, no Brandon or Ryan at his sides, no posse, no mocking glances. Just a boy trying to rebuild something he didn't know he had broken so badly. It wouldn't be easy. She didn't trust him completely yet. But she believed in the power of transformation. She'd seen it before, in herself. Brandon's return came with less grace. He showed up late to class his first day back, arms crossed, eyes scanning for challenge. But he didn't act out. He sat in silence, submitted his assignments, and stared at his notebook like it held answers to questions he didn't yet know how to ask. A few days later, during a creative writing exercise, Elena found a folded paper on her desk. It was a story, raw and unedited, about a fighter in a cage who kept hurting people because it was the only way he knew to feel powerful. Until one day, the fighter looked at his own reflection and couldn't recognize the man staring back. There was no name on it, but the handwriting was unmistakable. Elena didn't comment aloud. She just left a sticky note the next morning, this story matters. Keep writing. Ryan was different. Without the gravitational pull of Connor, he had drifted, untethered. He joined the debate team on a whim and stayed when he realized strategy and logic could earn him respect without cruelty. He didn't say much to Elena, but she noticed his arguments in class sharpened, his tone more thoughtful. One afternoon, she passed the library and saw him helping a freshman outline a persuasive essay. He didn't see her watching, and she didn't interrupt. Room 237 grew louder in good ways. Students laughed freely, challenged ideas, debated themes, and helped each other with group projects. Jessica led a student-led support group for bullying survivors. She'd named it, The Quiet Rise. Emma co-wrote a proposal with Maria to present workshops on digital safety and consent. David submitted one of his short stories to a citywide writing competition. Sophia's poem about healing had been published in the school literary magazine and read aloud during the morning announcements. Elena didn't take credit. She didn't have to. The students knew. They'd felt the shift the moment she stood her ground. And now they stood on their own. As spring approached, Elena received a message from the district office. She'd been nominated for New Teacher of the Year. The letter congratulated her on innovative curriculum, exceptional classroom management, and profound student impact. She smiled as she read it, not for the recognition, but for what it represented, a confirmation that her way, though difficult and often lonely, was right. But the true recognition came unexpectedly. One afternoon, just as class ended, Connor appeared at her desk again, this time with his father beside him. Richard Matthews looked like a man trying to make peace with discomfort. He cleared his throat and spoke stiffly. "Miss Rodriguez," he said. "I owe you an apology. When we first met, I was more concerned with protecting my son's reputation than understanding his behavior. You were right. He needed accountability. He needed help." Elena nodded once, measured, but not cold. "He's shown growth. That speaks well of him, and of you." Connor stepped forward, holding out an envelope. "I wanted you to have this," he said. "It's a recommendation letter I wrote, for your nomination. I know I'm not a teacher or administrator, but I thought maybe it would help." Elena opened the envelope later that night. Inside was a handwritten letter where Connor detailed how room 237 had changed him. How Elena had seen past his bravado and pushed him to see himself clearly. How her strength had taught him what real power looked like. "I know it doesn't undo the past," the letter ended, "but I wanted you to know you saved me from becoming someone I didn't like. I'm not finished changing, but because of you, I've started." Elena folded the letter slowly, her eyes lingering on the final line. In all her years of training, of teaching, of fighting battles with fists or with words, she had learned one unshakable truth. Redemption wasn't something you gave. It was something you made room for. And in room 237, there would always be room for those willing to try. The hardest students were often the ones who needed grace the most. And as long as Elena had breath and purpose, she would keep building that space. Because that was what teachers did. Not just instruct. Not just discipline. But believe, in change, in growth, in the quiet possibility that even the most lost could find their way back. The final week of school arrived with the slow, warm promise of summer. Sunlight stretched longer across the hallways, laughter echoed more freely between lockers, and the looming stress of exams softened into the sweet anticipation of freedom. For Elena Rodriguez, the end of the year did not feel like a conclusion but a transition, one chapter closing while the next waited just beyond the final bell. Room 237 had transformed. The walls, once blank and sterile, were now covered with vibrant student work, poetry penned with honesty, drawings born from healing, essays about strength and survival. The desk by the window where Jessica once sat in silence was now surrounded by her sketches, portraits of classmates who had learned to stand tall. David's comic strips lined the back wall, and Emma's article on digital safety had sparked a school-wide policy review. It was no longer just a classroom. It was a record of change. On Thursday afternoon, as the school prepared for graduation, Elena found herself alone in her room. Her desk was piled with thank you notes, folded drawings, and letters from students she hadn't realized she had reached. One note came from Alex, a quiet boy who rarely spoke in class. She unfolded the paper slowly, reading the simple message inside: "You probably don't remember me much, but I watched everything that happened this year. I was one of the kids too scared to stand up to Connor. But watching you, watching everyone else find their voice, it changed me. I'm not scared anymore. Thank you for showing me that even quiet kids can be brave." Elena held the letter in her hands for a long moment, her throat tight. She had never graded one of Alex's essays higher than AB, but his words carried more weight than any rubric could measure. Graduation day arrived beneath a cloudless sky. The field was packed with students in navy robes, families cheering from the bleachers, the sound system barely keeping up with the emotion that surged through every name called. When Connor Matthews stepped onto the stage, there was a pause, an uncertainty from the crowd. But then, slowly, the applause began. Polite, cautious, but real. He accepted his diploma with a solemn nod and stepped back into the line of graduates. Elena stood near the faculty row, watching. She didn't wave. But when his eyes met hers, he gave the smallest, most genuine smile he'd ever managed in her presence. It was enough. After the ceremony, students scattered in every direction, hugs, selfies, tears, and confetti rained down in equal measure. Elena was about to slip away when she heard a voice behind her. "Miss Rodriguez." She turned to see Jessica, her eyes bright with excitement. "I got in," she said, nearly breathless. "Art school. Full scholarship. They loved my portfolio." Elena's chest filled with pride. "You earned it. I never would have submitted it if it wasn't for your class. If it wasn't for you." Next came David, proudly holding a book. "They published my short story in the City Youth Anthology. I even got a check." Maria appeared beside him, her phone already open to an email. "My essay won the state scholarship. I'm going to the University of Denver, Mississippi tuition-free." Sophia shyly handed over a pamphlet for a local poetry contest. "They want me to read next month. In front of an audience." Elena took a moment with each of them, her heart quietly swelling. Every conversation, every late tutoring session, every firm line she had drawn, every moment she had nearly doubted herself, it had led to this. To these young people who now stood tall in their own names. Later that evening, as the sun dipped low and the parking lot slowly emptied, Connor returned. This time, he was not alone. Richard Matthews stood beside him, dressed more simply than usual, his face stripped of the usual pride and posturing. "Miss Rodriguez," he said, clearing his throat. "I came to thank you for not giving up on my son." Elena didn't offer a rehearsed reply. She simply nodded. Connor stepped forward, holding out a final envelope. "One more letter. I rewrote it." Inside was a recommendation for her nomination, longer this time, more personal. He wrote about how room 237 had been the first place where someone saw through him. How Elena had drawn a line, not to punish him, but to protect everyone. How she had taught him that real strength was found not in control, but in restraint. That leadership didn't come from fear, but from respect. "My counselor says I should study psychology," Connor said. "Work with at-risk youth. Help kids before they turn into someone like I was." "I think you'll have something valuable to say," Elena replied. As they left, Elena sat once more in her classroom, the shadows of evening stretching long across the desks. She looked around at the space that had held so much, fear, defiance, resilience, transformation. She placed Alex's note into her keepsake box, beside Maria's scholarship letter, Jessica's sketch, and a photo from the Self-Defense Club's final session. Every item was a story, a scar turned to strength. That summer, Elena trained at her local dojang, the familiar rhythm of practice grounding her. She enrolled in professional development courses, exploring new ways to integrate character education into literature. And when the back-to-school season arrived again, she walked into Jefferson High not just as an English teacher, but as a builder of culture, a protector of peace, and a spark of change. On the first day of the new school year, students filed into room 237, new faces, curious eyes, whispers of stories yet to be written. Elena stood at the front of the room, her hands clasped gently before her, her voice calm and clear. "Some of you may have heard stories about this classroom. About me. Let me be clear. I'm here to teach you to read and write, yes, but also to help you find your voice. In here, we challenge ideas, not people. We use words to build, not break. And we treat one another with respect, always." The students were silent for a moment, absorbing her presence, her words. Then one of them raised a hand. "Is it true you took down 3 seniors with a single move?" Elena smiled, just slightly. "It's true, I stood my ground. The rest is just legend." And as laughter trickled through the room, and pencils began to scribble across fresh notebooks, room 237 welcomed a new chapter. Its legacy not written in textbooks or test scores, but in the hearts of those who had walked through it, broken and uncertain, and emerged with the courage to stand, speak, and believe in something more. Because in the end, the greatest lesson Elena had ever taught wasn't about grammar or metaphor. It was this: true power isn't about domination. It's about transformation. And every student, no matter how lost, could change, if someone believed in them enough to hold the line, and never let go. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough?